Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 110. Beginning of the End. Kohaku had never driven so recklessly in her life, but she made it to the UA's campus in what must have been record time. When she got there, Hitoshi was sitting with a few of his classmates and teachers on the front steps. His hair was wet, and he was shoulder to shoulder with a green-haired girl as they both stared off into nothing. "Toshi!" she cried out as she ran to him. Her son and the other kid next to him looked up to her. Both of them were radiating the same muted fear and violent nothingness. It was a feeling she hadn't felt since she'd last seen Midoriya, and the thought of made her sick with worry for both of them. "Toshi, are you all right? You're not hurt?" she asked, even though she could see that he was physically fine. "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine," he confirmed. "Oh, thank Kami," she breathed out as she knelt down and pulled him to her chest. The kid next to him was looking at the two of them, but Kohaku didn't know her. Hitoshi hadn't spoken about school at all. He had hardly spoken to her altogether since the term started, but the girl looked so lost. So Kohaku grabbed her hand gently. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked. The girl looked at Hitoshi and then back to her before nodding. "That's good. I'm glad. Are your parents on their way?" "Yes, they should be here soon, Gero," the girl replied. "Good. Toshi and I will stay here with you until they show up. I'm his mom. You can call me Shinso or Kohaku, whichever is easier for you. I don't mind either way." She introduced herself. "Sue," the girl stated plainly. Kohaku assumed that must be her name. She sat on the step below them, leaning her side against Toshi's shins and using her lap as an armrest, while she kept her other hand loosely grasped around Sue's. "It's nice to meet you, Sue," she said kindly. Neither of them seemed ready to talk yet. Everyone around her was so tense and scared or angry, and it was suffocating. These kids were so afraid. There was a girl on the other side of the steps, clinging to a taller boy and crying her eyes out while he held her with the same blank expression Sue and Toshi had on their faces. She knew she probably shouldn't. She knew it was technically illegal, but she couldn't just sit by while everyone suffered. She didn't change what anyone was feeling, but she let herself exude a warm and radiant sense of calm. It was something she used to do to help Toshi when he had nightmares. It didn't stop any of the feelings from happening. It just put a warm blanket over the top of them, a gentle reminder that it hurt now, but it would be okay again eventually. She felt Toshi's tension lessen and saw Sue's shoulders drop. The overpowering negative cloud of emotion that emanated from everyone around her turned into a light fog. She felt like she could breathe again, and so did everyone else. She was worried that someone would notice, but no one besides Toshi seemed to pay her any mind. The girl on the other side of the stairs stopped crying around the same time Sue's parents showed up, and Kohaku bid her farewell so that she could go to them. Reluctantly, she left the crowd of traumatized kids to deal with their emotions on their own and ushered Toshi into the passenger seat of her car. He shut the door and buckled himself in, but he still didn't say anything. He didn't say anything until she parked the car outside their house and looked over to him when he didn't make any move to unbuckle himself or leave the car. She was about to ask, but Toshi beat her to it. "Midoriya's in my class," he stated plainly. Of all the things she had been expecting to hear, that wasn't one of them. "What?" she asked, more as a statement of confusion than a real question. "He might be dead," Toshi continued, seeing the non-question for what it was. "What?" she asked again. His lung was punctured, and his leg was crushed, and his arm was broken, and he was coughing up blood, and I don't know if he got to the hospital in time, he elaborated. For the first time since she saw him, his blank expression faltered. His lip trembled as tears started to stream down his face. He wasn't kidding, was he? This wasn't a joke. Kuhaku's heart dropped to her stomach. He never left Japan. He lied to us. And I was so angry. But what if he doesn't make it? What if he dies and I never get to? He cut himself off with a sob as he leaned forward and buried his face in his hands. She was so stunned. She didn't even react to her son breaking down for a few seconds. But after the third heaving cry forced its way out of his lungs, she pulled herself together and leaned over the center console to awkwardly hold him. She petted his still damp hair as she frantically tried to figure out how to respond. Recovery girl must have been there, right? He'll be okay, she tried to reassure. They took him in an ambulance, Hitoshi forced out around his sobs as he shook his head. The hospital isn't far from you, Toshi. He's probably fine, she said, reassuring herself as much as she was reassuring her son. She felt sick. Kohaku loved that kid like he were her own, and she missed him desperately over the last year. But he'd never reached out. She wasn't only worried about what was happening in the hospital, she was worried about whatever made him lie to them in the first place. If he never left Japan, then why did he leave them? He certainly didn't want to. She could feel that clear as day. She remembered his remorse with awful clarity. What forced him to make that decision? She had half a mind to start the car up again and head to the hospital, but she knew they wouldn't let them see him. They weren't related, and on paper, there wasn't any proof that they even knew each other. She was sure journalists and news reporters would be feeding the poor hospital staff the same story, trying to get information on the status of the teachers and students, like they always did whenever a hero got hurt in the line of duty. She couldn't help Midoriya right now, but she could help Toshi. Let's get inside. I'm sure it will be on the news before the end of the night. You still have his number, don't you? Why don't you text him? She offered, but Hitoshi just shook his head as he cried. It hurt to let go of him, but she had to. She got out of the car and quickly went over to Hitoshi's side, unbuckled him, and coaxed him out of his seat. He didn't even look up as she guided him inside. She didn't bother with their shoes and led Hitoshi to sit on the couch before she started pulling at his laces. Her vision was getting blurry with tears, but she ignored it. She set their shoes off to the side and pulled a blanket around them before flipping the TV on to the news channel and set the volume so low that they could barely hear it. It was loud enough to hear updates, but not loud enough to force their attention to it. They'd have to report on it eventually. News of the attack had already been broadcast, and the public wasn't going to rest until the status of the students and teachers was released. Kohaku wasn't going to rest until then. That was for sure. Katsuki was running into the central plaza to help All Might fight that thing when he did something he'd never done before. He froze. All Might looked to be struggling against the creature until he grabbed it by the weird beak that it had and pulled a knife out of its exposed brain before plunging it back in over and over and over again. The awful shrieks the beast let out were damn near deafening, and all he could think as he watched the symbol of peace brutally murder someone, or rather something, right in front of him was, that was Deku's knife. He had heard screaming earlier before they had made their way into the open, before he had a proper view of the plaza. But that couldn't have been. No, that wasn't. His denials were cut off by that same scream echoing out from the outer border of the plaza. Deku was on the ground next to Hobo Sensei, and they were both covered in blood. He could tell Deku's leg was broken even from the distance he was at, but he was still trying to get up, while Troll Doll held him back. He couldn't tell what he was saying from so far away, but it sounded like he was pleading. He sounded desperate, and all Katsuki could do was watch as he went limp and paramedics wheeled his lifeless form away. Was he couldn't. He didn't know how long he stood there frozen before Shitty Hair gently laid a hand on his shoulder. Katsuki reflexively wrenched himself out of his grasp and scowled. When he aimed a sharp look at him, his mouth was moving, but Katsuki had no clue what he was saying. It occurred to him that he wasn't really aware of anything that was going on around him, and he didn't like that, so he did his best to focus on figuring out what Shitty Hair was trying to say. Go, can you hear me? Are you all right? He finally managed to parse out, and once he did, it felt like the world fell back into clarity. Everything was so freaking loud, and he didn't realize how quiet it had all been just a second ago. Let's get you boys out of here, Recovery Girl said with a kind smile. Katsuki damn near jumped out of his skin at that. He hadn't realized she was even there, with her height bringing her just out of his normal field of vision. When did she get here? How did he not notice her? She wasn't exactly fast. It's not like she could creep up on them. He looked back over to Shitty Hair, and the look on his face told him that his flinch didn't go unnoticed. He was looking at him with concern that he didn't seem to be trying to conceal at all, and it pissed him off. He was fine. He was fine. He didn't need anyone's damn concern. He shouldered past the other boy and started making his way back to the entrance. He didn't have to stick around and deal with those two. Shuddering sobs had been forcing themselves through her battered lungs for what felt like hours as Ida held her on the front steps of UA's main campus. She had seen 13, Aizawa-sensei, and Midoriya as they were whisked away to ambulances. All three of them were so still and lifeless, and she couldn't erase the thought of how bright red the blood had looked against Midoriya's pale skin. Specks of it were mixed with the freckles on his cheeks, and a steady stream of it leaked out of the corner of his mouth with the wheezing breaths she could hear him struggle to take in. She had finally started to calm down when alarms started blaring for a second before quickly being shut off. She looked up with her heart in her stomach, expecting the worst, but it was a hero that had bust through the front gates, and none of the teachers around them looked panicked, just slightly annoyed as they shut off the alarm. Ingenium, a hero from Hosu, was shooting straight toward her, and she didn't even have the time to flinch before he wrapped both her and Ida in a hug. Tenya, he cried as he held them. Tensei, I'm all right. You're scaring her, Ida chastised. It was the first time she had heard him speak since they met back up at Central Campus. Sorry, Ingenium replied as he pulled back. He rested one hand on either of their shoulders and looked between them for a moment before releasing them to remove his helmet. The face that was revealed looked awfully familiar, and Ochako felt kind of stupid for not realizing who this was when he essentially had the same quirk as Ida. I'm Tensei Ida. You must be Uraraka. You can call me Tensei or Ten or Ida 10. Otherwise, this is going to get confusing. I'm Tenya's older brother. The elder Ida introduced himself with a kind and apologetic smile. She looked between the two of them dumbly, and she felt more tears start to brim in her eyes despite herself. She felt Ida's tension release the second his brother had come into view, but her parents wouldn't be able to get here until tomorrow morning at the earliest. She didn't want to be alone, and Ida's brother was about to take him away. Hey, it's all right. The hero tried to soothe as he grabbed her hand gently. She just shook her head and buried her face in Ida's shoulder again. He couldn't leave her here. Uraraka, I'm not going anywhere, Ida reassured her as he brought his hand back up to the space between her shoulder blades. She wondered if she had said that out loud or if she was just that obvious. Either way, she felt relief wash over her. She knew it was a lie. Ida was going to have to leave eventually. She couldn't keep him hostage here forever. But going back to her empty little studio apartment that could be more aptly described as a glorified broom closet by herself, right now was the absolute last thing she wanted. 13's blood was still under her nails, and she couldn't bear the thought of being left alone to scrub them raw until her own blood replaced it. Do you know when your family is going to get here, Uraraka? Ingenium asked after she managed to pry her face away from where she'd hidden it. The question made her want to go right back. Her parents live in the south. I can't imagine they'll make it here before tomorrow morning. Ida thankfully answered for her. Does she live alone? Ingenium asked Ida. She was grateful that he didn't expect her to talk, and she was even more grateful that Ida didn't have to see the things she saw. If they were both in the same state right now, she couldn't imagine this interaction would be going as smoothly. Yes, she rooms in a nearby hostel, Ida answered. She looked between the two of them as they appeared to be having a conversation comprised entirely of eyebrow raises and head nods before they both shifted their attention back to her. Do you want to stay with our family until your parents make it to town? We have plenty of room in our house. It's only a half-hour east of here, Ida offered. It was all she could do not to burst into tears again as she nodded readily before Ida even fully finished his sentence. She was too grateful to put into words. She wouldn't be alone. She wouldn't have to curse herself all night for not having gotten Midoriya's number yet. Kami, she thought she would have more time. She thought he would have more time. No, she would have more time. They both would. All three of them would. She wasn't going to be alone tonight, and she wasn't going to be alone at lunch whenever classes reconvened. All three of them would be there together, just as they had been for the past few days. Everything was going to be all right. It had to be. Izuku was under strict orders from Recovery Girl to not overwork himself, and he was doing his best to heed that command. But he felt like he was going to crawl out of his skin. He'd gotten the cast off his leg, but his whole body still hurt. He couldn't get comfortable no matter how he positioned himself. He couldn't sleep either. Well, he could, but he always woke up screaming. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eraser's face shattered on the concrete, or All Might's skeletal form torn apart by the Nomu, or Shinso and Asui floating in the lake as the water turned red around them. He had hardly been able to eat, and what he did manage to stomach felt like lead going down. More than once, he caught himself staring at the corkboard as tears fell unbidden from his eyes. He had just over 3 weeks before the jig was up, and that, more than any of the gruesome scenes that unfolded behind his eyelids, is what had bile churning in his gut. Izuku had been texting Eraser as much as he thought he could get away with. He said he'd gotten his casts off too, and he was back home, but he hadn't been cleared for patrol and likely wouldn't be for at least another week. He worried about what had become of Uptown in their absence. He worried what would become of Uptown in 3 weeks' time. He'd poured his blood, sweat, and tears into this city for 4 years. He'd dedicated his life to it. This was his city. These were his people. And he was just going to leave them for dead. Every time he'd thought he'd run out of tears to shed, he proved himself wrong. He'd been crying his eyes out for 3 days now, and there didn't seem to be an end in sight. He'd made a plan, at least. He was going to tell Eraser that he'd gotten into one of the internship programs he'd told them about. He was going to tell him that they were on track to becoming a real hero and they needed to hang up their metaphorical cape before they got caught. Eraser would never have believed them if they said they were just going to stop or that they were moving away. He knew them too well to think they'd ever give this whole thing up for good. He was going to tell him that he'd see them when they got their license and hope to Kami that he'd be able to pick up where they'd left off 3 years later. He would tell him one day. After he graduated, he would tell him the truth because he couldn't bear the thought of losing him after everything they'd been through. After he did that, he was going to hide or destroy all of his gear, eradicate any bit of physical evidence that Ivy ever existed, and he was going to show up to the parent-teacher conference and tell them the truth, or at least part of it. He would look All Might in the eye and tell him that he'd been lying to him the whole time and hope to Kami that he forgave him. He'd probably end up in the foster system, and the thought of that terrified him. A stranger's home could never be his. He would be a guest at best, but more likely than not, he would spend the next 3 years feeling like an intruder. And that was if he was lucky enough to be placed in a good home. This part of his life was over. He felt like an idiot for thinking he could keep up the charade for 3 years. Every time he opened his eyes, he saw what he was about to lose, and every time he closed them, he saw what he had been so close to losing. It was torture, and as much as he didn't want to face his peers tomorrow, he couldn't bear to stay here like this. End of chapter.